I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into my backyard on that Tuesday morning in March and saw the fresh dirt mound stretching across my lawn like a badly healed surgical scar. The grass I'd spent 2 summers nurturing lay torn and scattered, replaced by a crude line of displaced soil that ran from the property fence all the way to the drainage ditch near the street. My coffee mug nearly slipped from my hand as I stood there in my bathrobe, staring at what looked like someone had driven a tractor through my yard in the middle of the night. I'm Connor Hayes, and I'd lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Naperville, Illinois for exactly 4 years. 4 peaceful, mostly uneventful years where the biggest drama involved my neighbor's dog occasionally using my flower beds as a bathroom. I worked as an IT consultant from home, which meant I spent most of my time in my house, and I definitely would have noticed if someone had asked permission to dig up my entire backyard. They hadn't. I walked closer to the mound, my bare feet getting soaked from the morning dew on what remained of my grass. The trench had been filled in, but whoever did it hadn't bothered to level it properly or replace the sod. I could see where they'd cut through the roots of my Japanese maple, leaving jagged tears in the bark. That tree had cost me $300 at the nursery. I crouched down and pushed some of the loose dirt aside, revealing a white PVC pipe about 8 inches in diameter, running just beneath the surface. My phone was in my hand before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. I called my next-door neighbor, Pete Richardson, who'd lived here since the subdivision was built in 2018. "Pete, did you see anyone working in my yard yesterday?" "Oh yeah," he said, sounding way too casual for what he was about to tell me. "The HOA crew was out there most of the afternoon. Brenda said something about drainage improvements at the last meeting." "What meeting? I didn't get any notice about this." There was a pause. "You didn't go to the March meeting?" "I didn't know there was a March meeting. And even if there was, they can't just dig up my property without telling me directly." "Man, I don't know what to tell you. Brenda seemed pretty set on getting it done. You should probably give her a call." Brenda Carmichael, of course. The HOA president was a 52-year-old woman who'd appointed herself the guardian of Meadowbrook Heights property values and community standards. I'd had exactly 3 interactions with her in 4 years, and each one had left me feeling like I'd been scolded by a particularly aggressive mall security guard. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a vanity plate that read BST Mum and had opinions about everything from mailbox heights to acceptable Christmas decoration colors. I went inside, got dressed, and pulled up the HOA contact information from the folder of documents I'd received when I bought the house. Brenda's cell phone number was listed as the primary contact for all community concerns. I dialed it while staring out my kitchen window at the destruction in my backyard. "This is Brenda." Her voice had that clipped, efficient tone of someone who considered phone calls an interruption to more important matters. "Brenda, this is Connor Hayes from 847 Willow Court. Someone dug a trench through my entire backyard and I never received any notification about it." "Oh, Connor, yes, we discussed the drainage project at last month's meeting. It was approved by a vote of the board. I wasn't at that meeting and nobody contacted me directly about digging up my property. The meeting was announced via email 2 weeks in advance. All residents are expected to stay informed about HOA business, and technically, the drainage system serves the entire community, so the board has the authority to make improvements as needed." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "Brenda, you can't just dig up someone's private property without direct notification. That's not how easements work. I'm sure you'll find everything is in order if you review your HOA covenant documents. The board has the right to access properties for maintenance and improvements that benefit the community. This drainage pipe will help prevent flooding in the lower lots. My lot isn't one of the lower lots, and you destroyed my Japanese maple. I'll make a note that you have concerns. You're welcome to submit a formal complaint in writing at the next board meeting. Have a nice day, Connor." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, anger burning in my chest. I'd dealt with difficult people in my work life, but Brenda Carmichael was something else entirely. She had the special kind of confidence that came from years of being in charge of something small enough to control completely. I spent the next hour photographing the damage from every angle. The trench ran roughly 40 feet across my property, entering near the back fence and exiting near the side yard where it connected to the street drainage system. They hadn't just damaged the grass. They'd cut through the roots of 2 trees, destroyed a section of my flower bed that my mother had helped me plant last spring, and left chunks of clay and subsoil scattered across what used to be a level lawn. By noon, I was sitting in the office of Mark Sullivan, a real estate attorney whose name I'd found through a Google search. His office was in downtown Naperville, in one of those converted Victorian houses that lawyers seem to love. Mark was about 40 with graying hair and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd heard every property dispute story imaginable. "So they didn't notify you directly?" he asked after I'd explained the situation. "Nothing. No letter, no phone call, no knock on my door. Just an email about an HOA meeting that I apparently missed." Mark pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "Did you receive the email?" "I checked my spam folder. Nothing. I think it might have bounced because I changed my email address last year and never updated it with the HOA. That's actually important. HOAs have an obligation to maintain current contact information, but homeowners also have an obligation to keep the HOA informed of changes. Did you try to update your email with them?" I thought back. "I don't think so. I didn't even think about it." That might complicate things slightly, but it doesn't give them the right to do major excavation work without direct notification, especially if they knew or should have known their emails weren't reaching you. "Let me look at your covenant documents." I handed him the folder I'd brought. He spent 20 minutes reading through the HOA bylaws and covenants, occasionally making notes or highlighting sections. Finally, he looked up. "Okay, so here's the situation. The HOA does have provisions for maintaining common drainage systems, but your property isn't designated as a drainage easement on the original plat. That means they would have needed either your explicit permission or a formal easement agreement to run that pipe through your yard. The fact that they did it without either is a problem for them. So what do I do? First, send them a formal written demand to restore your property to its original condition. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Give them 15 days to respond. If they refuse or ignore you, we can file for an injunction and potentially sue for damages. The tree damage alone is going to be expensive. Japanese maples are considered ornamental tree, and you can claim the full replacement value of a mature specimen. How much are we talking? Depending on the size and age of your tree, potentially several $1,000s, plus the cost of re-landscaping, soil remediation, and compensation for loss of use and enjoyment of your property. If they're particularly unreasonable about this, we might even have a case for punitive damages given the willful nature of the trespass. Mark helped me draft a formal demand letter. It was professional but firm, laying out exactly what they'd done wrong and what I expected them to do about it. We sent it that afternoon via certified mail, and I drove home feeling slightly more in control of the situation. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. On Friday morning, it started raining. Not the gentle spring rain that makes everything smell fresh and green, but the kind of heavy, relentless downpour that turns streets into rivers and makes you wonder if you should start building an ark. By afternoon, my backyard was a swamp. Water pooled everywhere, but especially along that fresh dirt mound where the HOA had buried their pipe. By evening, the mound had begun to sink and shift, creating a miniature canyon that water poured into. I stood at my back door watching muddy water cascade across my lawn. The pipe underneath was clearly not functioning the way it was supposed to. Instead of draining water away, the disturbed soil was channeling it into a depression that kept growing deeper with every hour. By the time I went to bed, there was standing water 6 inches deep covering a third of my backyard. Saturday morning brought more rain and a knock on my door. I opened it to find Pete from next door standing on my porch with an umbrella, looking apologetic. "Connor, man, I hate to tell you this, but water is starting to come into my basement. I think it's coming from your yard." I grabbed my raincoat and followed him outside. The water in my backyard had risen to nearly a foot deep in places, and it was definitely flowing toward Pete's house. His basement window wells were overflowing, and I could see water seeping in around the foundation. "This is from that drainage pipe they installed," I said. "The ground settled wrong, and now it's directing water toward your property instead of away from it. What do I do? I've got water coming in pretty fast. Call Brenda. This is the HOA's problem now." I went back inside and called Brenda myself. It went to voicemail. I left a message explaining the flooding situation and the fact that her drainage improvement was now causing exactly the problem it was supposed to prevent. Then I called Mark Sullivan and left him a message too. The rain continued all weekend. By Sunday, 3 more neighbors had contacted me about water problems. The Johnsons, 2 houses down, had water in their garage. The Patel family across the street had standing water in their flower beds that was killing their landscaping. And Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, called to tell me her sump pump was running constantly and she was worried it would burn out. All of it traced back to that badly installed drainage pipe in my yard. The hastily backfilled trench had settled unevenly, creating channels that directed water in completely wrong directions. It was like they'd built a water distribution system specifically designed to flood the neighborhood. Brenda finally called me back on Sunday evening. I could hear the tension in her voice immediately. "Connor, I've had 6 calls today about flooding issues. What's going on?" "What's going on is that your drainage pipe was installed improperly, and now it's causing exactly the flooding problem you claimed it would prevent. My backyard is a lake, Pete's basement is flooding, and half the neighborhood is dealing with water damage." "That's not possible. We hired a licensed contractor to do the work. Then your licensed contractor did a terrible job. You need to get someone out here first thing Monday morning to fix this before it causes serious property damage. I'll look into it. But I'm sure you're exaggerating the scope of the problem." "Brenda, I have a foot of standing water in my backyard. Pete has water in his basement. This is not an exaggeration. I'll send someone to assess the situation." She hung up without saying goodbye. Monday morning arrived with more rain. I'd barely slept, worried about the water continuing to rise and spread. At 8 in the morning, a white pickup truck with Martinez Landscaping painted on the side pulled up in front of my house. 2 men in work clothes got out and started walking around my backyard, taking photos and measurements. I went out to talk to them. "You with the HOA?" I asked. The older of the 2 men nodded. "Yeah, we're the ones who installed the pipe last week. Brenda called and said there were some concerns." "Concerns? Look at this." I gestured at the lake that used to be my lawn. "Your pipe is causing massive flooding." He frowned and walked closer to the sunken trench. "The ground settled more than we expected. That happens sometimes with spring soil when it's still got a lot of moisture. So what are you going to do about it?" "I'll have to talk to Brenda. This kind of remediation work wasn't in our original contract." "I don't care about your contract. This needs to be fixed now before it causes more damage." He held up his hands defensively. "Look, man, I just do the work I'm hired to do. You'll have to take it up with the HOA." They left 10 minutes later. I immediately called Mark Sullivan. "They're trying to dodge responsibility," I told him. "The contractor says it's a contract issue with the HOA. The HOA acts like it's not their problem. Meanwhile, my entire backyard is underwater and damaging my neighbor's properties too." Okay, this has escalated beyond a simple property dispute. The ongoing flooding creates liability issues for both the HOA and the contractor. I'm going to draft an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and an injunction requiring immediate remediation. We'll file it this afternoon. How long will that take? For an emergency motion, we could potentially get a hearing by Wednesday if we can show imminent risk of ongoing damage. And given that you've got flooding affecting multiple properties, that shouldn't be hard. Mark was as good as his word. By Tuesday morning, the HO had been served with notice of our motion. Brenda called me at 9 in the morning, and her voice had completely changed from Sunday's defensive tone. Now she sounded angry. "Connor, you're suing the HOA over some drainage work?" "Over destruction of my property and causing flooding that's damaging multiple homes in the neighborhood." "Yes, Brenda, I'm suing. This is completely unnecessary. We were going to address the settling issues." "When?" "After my neighbor's basements are ruined. After the water damage costs tens of thousands of dollars to repair." "You're overreacting." "Am I? Go look at Pete Richardson's basement and tell him I'm overreacting." There was a long silence. "The board is going to hear about this." "Good. Maybe the board will realize that you can't just dig up people's property without permission and then walk away when your work causes problems." She hung up. I felt a small surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the fact that it was still raining and my backyard was still flooded. The court hearing happened on Wednesday morning at the DuPage County Courthouse in Wheaton. Mark and I sat on one side of the courtroom while Brenda and an attorney representing the HOA sat on the other. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Warner, who looked like she'd seen every kind of property dispute imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of them. Mark presented our case efficiently. He showed photos of my destroyed yard, documentation of the flooding, statements from affected neighbors, and a report from an independent drainage engineer who'd examined the site Tuesday afternoon and concluded that the pipe had been installed improperly with inadequate soil compaction and incorrect grading. The HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Gerald Finch, argued that the HOA had acted within its authority under the covenant and that any settling issues were normal and would resolve themselves naturally. Judge Warner looked at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Finch, are you seriously arguing that flooding multiple properties is within the normal scope of expected settling?" "Your Honor, these are temporary issues that occur with any drainage work, temporary issues that are causing ongoing damage." She flipped through the photos Mark had submitted. "I'm looking at standing water that's been present for 5 days and appears to be getting worse, not better. That's not temporary." She granted our motion. The HOA was ordered to immediately hire a qualified drainage engineer to assess and repair the installation, restore my property to its original condition, and implement temporary flooding mitigation measures for all affected properties. They had 48 hours to begin the work. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I'd actually won something. Mark cautioned me that this was just the first step, but at least it was movement in the right direction. Thursday morning, a different contractor showed up. This one had Anderson Drainage Solutions on his truck and actually seemed to know what he was doing. Dave Anderson was a man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and the calm competence of someone who'd solved problems like this 100 times before. "Your HOA hired the cheapest contractor they could find and got exactly what they paid for," he told me after spending an hour examining the pipe installation. "This is amateur work. The trench wasn't dug deep enough, they didn't use proper bedding material for the pipe, and they backfilled it with straight clay. Clay doesn't drain. That's why you've got water pooling everywhere. Can you fix it?" "I can, but it's going to require digging the whole thing up and doing it right. Proper depth, gravel bedding, engineered backfill, the works. We're probably looking at a week of work, weather permitting. What about the flooding in the meantime?" "I'll bring in some pumps today to move the standing water. That should help with the immediate problem while we work on the permanent fix." True to his word, Dave and his crew brought in 3 industrial pumps that afternoon. By Friday morning, most of the standing water was gone, though my backyard looked like a construction site, which technically it was. Dave and his crew spent the next week ripping out the badly installed pipe and redoing everything correctly. I watched from my kitchen window as they worked, marveling at how different their approach was from the first contractor. They dug the trench 18 inches deeper, lined it with gravel, installed the pipe with a proper slope, and backfilled it with a mixture of sand and soil that would actually allow water to drain. When they were done, they brought in a bobcat and carefully leveled and graded my entire backyard before laying new sod over the affected areas. "This should actually work now," Dave told me on Thursday of the following week. "Water will flow through the pipe to the street drainage like it's supposed to, and your yard won't turn into a retention pond every time it rains." "Thank you. I wish they'd hired you in the first place." He shrugged. "HOAs usually go with the lowest bid. They see a quote, and they just pick the cheapest number without thinking about quality or experience. Then they end up paying twice when it has to be fixed." I asked him to document everything he'd done and everything that had been wrong with the original installation. That documentation was going to be important for the next phase of my legal case. Brenda called me that Friday evening. "The drainage work is complete. We've fulfilled our obligations under the court order. I trust this matter is now resolved." "Not even close. Brenda, you still owe me compensation for the tree damage, the destroyed landscaping, and the time and stress this has caused. Plus, my neighbors are dealing with water damage repair costs. The HOA is not responsible for incidental damages. We fixed the drainage issue as ordered. You fixed the problem you created by trespassing on my property in the first place. That doesn't absolve you of liability for the damage you caused. If you want to pursue this further, you'll have to go through our insurance company. I'm done dealing with you directly." She gave me a policy number and the name of an insurance adjuster, then hung up. I spent the next week playing phone tag with the insurance company. The adjuster, a woman named Patricia Morris, seemed reasonable enough when I finally got her on the phone. She came out to look at my property the following Monday, took photos of the damaged trees and landscaping, and measured the affected areas. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Hayes," she said as we stood in my backyard. "This is a clear case of trespass and negligent property damage. The HOA acted without proper authority, caused significant damage, and then made it worse with poor remediation work. My recommendation is going to be a settlement payment that covers all your documented losses plus a reasonable amount for general damages. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I'll have my report done by the end of the week. After that, it goes to the Claims Review Committee, and they'll make a decision within 2 weeks. If you're not satisfied with their offer, you can always continue with litigation, but my guess is they're going to want to settle this quickly and quietly. She was right. 2 weeks later, I received a settlement offer from the insurance company. They were offering $23,000 to cover the cost of replacing the Japanese maple with a mature specimen, professional re-landscaping of the damaged areas, compensation for the flower beds my mother had helped plant, and general damages for the stress and loss of use of my property. They also agreed to pay for a property assessment to ensure no long-term damage had been done to my soil or drainage. Mark reviewed the offer and advised me to take it. You could probably get more if you went to trial, but trials are expensive and time-consuming. This offer covers your actual damages and provides reasonable compensation for the headache factor. Unless you want to spend the next year fighting with the HOA, I'd recommend accepting. I accepted the offer. The check arrived a week later, but I wasn't done with Brenda Carmichael. Over the next few months, I started paying attention to HOA business in a way I never had before. I went to every board meeting, read every email announcement, and reviewed every financial disclosure. What I found was disturbing. The drainage project that had torn up my yard had cost the HOA $8,000, paid to Martinez Landscaping. But when I looked at the meeting minutes from the month before, the approved budget for drainage improvements had been $15,000. Where did the other $7,000 go? I started digging through the HOA's public financial records, which by Illinois law had to be available to any homeowner who requested them. It took 3 written requests and a threat to file a complaint with the Illinois Attorney General's office before Brenda finally handed over copies of the last 2 years of financial statements. What I found made my stomach turn. There were payments to consulting fees that seemed excessive. There were charges for community improvement projects that nobody could remember seeing. There were reimbursements to Brenda personally for expenses that seemed questionable at best. In total, over the past 2 years, roughly $40,000 in HOA funds had been spent on items that either couldn't be accounted for or seemed unnecessarily expensive. I wasn't an accountant, but I knew enough to recognize that something was wrong. I made copies of everything and scheduled a meeting with Mark Sullivan. He reviewed the documents carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is beyond my expertise," he finally said. "You need a forensic accountant to review these records. If what you're suggesting is true, Brenda Carmichael may have been embezzling HOA funds. Can you recommend someone?" He gave me the name of an accounting firm that specialized in fraud investigation. I contacted them the next day. Jennifer Chen was the forensic accountant assigned to review the HOA's financial records. She was in her 30s, sharp and focused, with the kind of attention to detail that made her perfect for finding money that didn't want to be found. I gave her everything I had, and she spent 3 weeks going through it with a fine-tooth comb. Her report was damning. Jennifer had identified over $60,000 in questionable transactions over the past 3 years. Some of it was outright fraud, payments to vendors that didn't exist or services that were never performed. Some of it was self-dealing, where Brenda had awarded contracts to companies she had financial connections to and received kickbacks. And some of it was just old-fashioned theft, reimbursements for personal expenses disguised as HOA business costs. "This is sufficient evidence to file a police report," Jennifer told me when she presented her findings. "This isn't just civil misconduct. This is criminal fraud and embezzlement." I contacted the Naperville Police Department the next day. I met with Detective Robert Manning, a veteran investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit. He reviewed Jennifer's report and the supporting documents I'd brought. "This is solid work," he said after reading through everything. "We'll open an investigation. I need you to understand that these cases take time. We'll need to subpoena bank records, interview witnesses, and build a comprehensive case. It could be months before we make any arrests." "I understand. I just want to make she doesn't keep stealing from the community. We'll do our job. In the meantime, don't discuss this investigation with anyone, especially not with Ms. Carmichael or any other HOA board members. If they get wind of the investigation, they might start destroying evidence." Keeping quiet was harder than I expected. I wanted to shout from the rooftops that Brenda Carmichael was a thief and a fraud. but I understood the need to let the police do their work properly. I watched from a distance over the next several months as the investigation proceeded. Detective Manning would occasionally call to ask follow-up questions or request additional documents, but mostly I was just waiting. The investigation came to a head in late September. I was working from home on a Thursday afternoon when I saw two police cars pull up in front of Brenda's house 3 doors down. Detective Manning and another officer got out, walked to her door, and knocked. When Brenda answered, they spoke with her briefly before I saw Manning pull out handcuffs. Brenda Carmichael was arrested that afternoon on charges of theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The police seized her computers, financial records, and file boxes full of HOA documents. News spread through the neighborhood within hours. Pete called me that evening. "Did you see them arrest Brenda?" "I saw. Do you know what it's about?" "I have a pretty good idea." I told him about the financial irregularities I'd discovered and the investigation I'd triggered. "Holy crap, Connor. You think she was stealing from the HOA the whole time?" "I don't think. I know. The forensic accountant found over $60,000 in fraudulent transactions. No wonder she was always so aggressive about staying in control of the board. She was covering up her own theft." The story made the local news 2 days later. The Naperville Sun ran a front-page article about the arrest of an HOA president for embezzlement. They didn't name Brenda directly due to the pending charges, but everyone in Meadowbrook Heights knew exactly who it was. The HOA called an emergency meeting the following week. With Brenda under arrest and awaiting trial, the board had to elect a new president and figure out how to move forward. I attended the meeting along with probably 60 other homeowners, the largest turnout anyone could remember for an HOA meeting. The board's vice president, a mild-mannered engineer named Tom Bradshaw, reluctantly took over as acting president. He started the meeting by acknowledging the situation. "I know everyone has questions about what happened with Brenda. All I can tell you is that she's been charged with financial crimes related to her management of HOA funds. There's an ongoing criminal investigation, and we've been advised not to discuss the specifics. What I can tell you is that the board is cooperating fully with law enforcement, and we've hired an independent accounting firm to audit all of our finances for the past 5 years. A woman in the back raised her hand. "How much money did she steal?" "We don't have final numbers yet, but preliminary estimates suggest it could be substantial. We're also working with our insurance carrier to determine what coverage we have for this kind of loss." Another homeowner stood up. "How did this happen? Wasn't anyone watching what she was doing?" Tom looked uncomfortable. In hindsight, there were red flags that should have been caught. Brenda maintained very tight control over the financial records, and she discouraged board oversight by claiming it was more efficient if she handled everything herself. Several of us trusted her when we shouldn't have. The meeting went on for 2 hours. People were angry, hurt, and worried about what this meant for the community's finances. Some homeowners suggested we might need to pass a special assessment to cover the stolen funds. Others wanted to know if previous board members could be held liable for failing to provide proper oversight. I stayed quiet through most of it, but near the end of the meeting I stood up to speak. "I just want to say that this situation started for me when the HOA buried a drainage pipe through my yard without permission. That led to property damage, flooding, and a legal fight. But in the process of dealing with that situation, I started looking more closely at how the HOA was being managed. What I found was systematic fraud that had been going on for years. This is a reminder that we all need to pay attention to what's being done in our name and with our money. HOAs have a lot of power over our properties and our lives, but that power requires oversight and accountability. We failed to provide that, and Brenda Carmichael took advantage." There was a moment of silence, then scattered applause. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me for uncovering the fraud. A few apologized for not supporting me more strongly when I'd been fighting with Brenda about the drainage pipe. "We all just figured you were being difficult," one neighbor admitted. "Brenda made it sound like you were the problem. Now we know she was the problem all along." Brenda Carmichael's trial took place the following spring. The DuPage County State's Attorney's Office had built a comprehensive case, documenting 3 years of systematic fraud and embezzlement totaling $78,000. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing deposits to her personal accounts that corresponded with HOA payments to fake vendors, reimbursement requests for personal expenses like family vacations and her daughter's college tuition, and even cash withdrawals that she'd disguised as payments for community improvement projects. Her defense attorney tried to argue that the HOA's financial management practices were sloppy and that any irregularities were the result of poor record-keeping rather than criminal intent. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony and deliberation, they found her guilty on all counts. Judge Warner, the same judge who'd heard my emergency motion about the drainage pipe, sentenced Brenda to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. She also barred Brenda from ever serving on any HOA board in Illinois. "You were given a position of trust within your community," Judge Warner said during sentencing. "Your neighbors elected you to manage their funds and protect their interests. Instead, you stole from them systematically and brazenly for years. You used the money meant for community improvements to fund your personal lifestyle. When one homeowner started asking questions, you retaliated by approving destructive work on his property. Your actions show a complete disregard for the responsibilities of your position and the trust placed in you. This sentence reflects the serious nature of your crimes." I attended the sentencing hearing. Watching Brenda being led away in handcuffs after trying to destroy my property and then steal from the entire community for years gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Justice wasn't always fast, but in this case it had been thorough. The HOA eventually recovered about half of the stolen money through insurance and the forced sale of Brenda's assets. We had to pass a modest special assessment to cover the rest, but homeowners accepted it as the cost of fixing a problem we'd all allowed to develop through inattention. Tom Bradshaw remained as HOA president, and under his leadership, the board implemented new financial controls including mandatory annual audits by an independent firm, term limits for board positions, and quarterly financial reports available to all homeowners. We also created a policy requiring direct written notification to any homeowner before any work was done on their property, regardless of what the covenant documents technically allowed. My backyard eventually recovered from the drainage pipe installation. The new Japanese maple I'd planted with the insurance settlement money grew quickly, and within a year, you couldn't tell there had ever been a trench running across my lawn. The drainage system itself actually worked properly now that it had been installed correctly, and we made it through the following spring's heavy rains without any flooding issues. Pete Richardson and I became closer friends through the whole ordeal. We started having weekly backyard barbecues in the summer, and he never missed an opportunity to tell the story of how I'd taken down the corrupt HOA president. "Connor's the guy who saved the neighborhood. He'd tell anyone who'd listen. Brenda was stealing from all of us, and he's the one who figured it out and did something about it. I always downplayed my role. I just didn't want someone digging up my yard without permission. Everything else followed from that. But privately, I knew it was more than that. The unauthorized drainage pipe had been a violation that I couldn't ignore, and when I'd started pulling on that thread, the whole corrupt tapestry had unraveled. Sometimes the biggest crimes are uncovered because someone refuses to accept a smaller injustice. My mother came to visit that fall, and I showed her the new flower beds I'd planted to replace the ones that had been destroyed. She was impressed by how much work I'd put into restoring and improving the yard. "You know, when you first told me about the HOA digging up your property, I was worried you were getting into something you couldn't handle," she said as we sat on my back deck watching the sunset. "But you handled it exactly right. You stood up for yourself, you followed the proper legal process, and you uncovered something much bigger in the process. I just got tired of being pushed around by someone who thought her position gave her unlimited power. That's exactly when someone needs to stand up. Most people would have just accepted it and moved on. I'm proud of you." Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that my mother was right. The easy path would have been to let Brenda's trespass and property damage slide, maybe negotiate some minimal compensation and avoid the conflict. But taking the easy path would have left a criminal in charge of our community's finances. Continuing to steal and abuse her power, the fight had been exhausting and stressful. There were times when I'd wanted to just walk away and forget the whole thing, but I'd pushed through, and the result was a cleaner, more accountable HOA and a neighborhood that was better protected against future abuse. I still work from home as an IT consultant, and I still live at 847 Willow Court in Meadowbrook Heights. But now when I look out my kitchen window at my backyard, I don't just see grass and trees. I see evidence that standing up for your rights matters. that holding people accountable is worth the effort, and that sometimes a buried drainage pipe can uncover buried crimes. The neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm after Brenda's conviction. Tom Bradshaw proved to be a competent and honest HOA president, more focused on actual community improvement than on power and control. We repaved the subdivision roads, updated the playground equipment at the community park, and even installed new LED streetlights that reduced our energy costs. At one of the HOA meetings, a new homeowner who just moved in asked about the drainage system in our neighborhood. Tom explained the history without naming names. We had some issues a few years ago with improper installation that caused flooding problems. It was corrected by a professional contractor, and we've had no problems since. We also learned some valuable lessons about contractor selection and project oversight. After the meeting, the new homeowner came up to me. Tom mentioned you were the one who caught the problems with the original drainage work. I was the one whose yard they dug up without permission, I said. Everything else followed from that. Well, thanks for caring enough to fight it. My last neighborhood had an HOA that was completely out of control. It's nice to know this one has people who pay attention. That conversation stuck with me. The stereotype of HOAs as petty dictatorships run by power-hungry bureaucrats exists because too many of them actually operate that way. But they don't have to. An HOA can be a useful tool for maintaining property values and organizing community resources if it's run by honest people with appropriate oversight. The key is that homeowners have to stay engaged. You can't just pay your dues and ignore how your community is being managed. That's how people like Brenda Carmichael gain unchecked power and abuse it. I made a point of encouraging my neighbors to attend HOA meetings and review financial reports. Some of them grumbled about the time commitment, but most understood after what we'd been through. Our meeting attendance stayed high, and board elections became actual contested votes rather than rubber stamps for whoever was willing to volunteer. One evening in late October, almost 2 years after the drainage pipe had first appeared in my yard, I was raking leaves when Brenda's husband pulled up in front of their house. I hadn't seen him in months. He'd moved out shortly after her arrest and had been living somewhere else while trying to rebuild his life. Now he was apparently back to pack up the last of their belongings before the house was sold to cover restitution payments. He saw me in my yard and walked over. "Connor, you got a minute?" "Sure, Dan. How are you doing?" He looked tired and older than I remembered. "I'm managing. Look, I know you're a big part of why Brenda's in prison. I don't blame you for that. She did what she did, and she deserved to face consequences. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in my family is like her. Our kids are good people, and this has been hell for them. I'm sorry they got caught up in it. I never wanted to hurt your family. I know, Brenda made her own choices, but I also wanted to say thank you. That caught me off guard. Thank you for not letting her get away with it. I knew something was wrong with our finances, but whenever I asked questions, she'd shut me down or distract me with something else. I convinced myself I was imagining things. If you hadn't pushed back when she buried that pipe in your yard, she'd still be stealing from the neighborhood and lying about everything. Eventually, it would have gotten worse and more people would have been hurt. You stopped her before she could do more damage. We talked for a few more minutes before he went back to his packing. I went back to raking leaves, thinking about his words. I'd never considered that holding Brenda accountable might have actually prevented worse crimes down the road. But he was probably right. Criminals who get away with things tend to get bolder, to push boundaries further. If she'd never been caught, there's no telling how much she eventually would have stolen, or what other abuses of power she might have committed. That winter was quiet and uneventful, exactly the way suburban life is supposed to be. Snow fell, I shoveled my driveway, and the neighborhood settled into the peaceful routine of cold weather and holiday preparations. My backyard drainage system handled the spring thaw perfectly when the weather warmed, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction knowing that it was finally working the way it should have from the beginning. In March, Tom Bradshaw announced he wouldn't be running for election as HOA president. He'd done a good job cleaning up after Brenda's mess, but he was ready to step back and let someone else take on the responsibilities. Several people asked if I'd be willing to run. I thought about it seriously. Part of me wanted to decline, to stay out of HOA politics and just live my life. But another part of me recognized that I had experience now with both the legal framework and the potential for abuse. I could help build on Tom's reforms and make sure the HOA remained accountable and transparent. I agreed to run, and I won the election with strong support from neighbors who remembered how I'd uncovered Brenda's fraud. My first act as HOA president was to establish a finance committee with rotating membership, ensuring that no one person ever had unquestioned control over community funds again. My second act was to create a property rights protection policy explicitly stating that no work could be done on any homeowner's private property without written consent, regardless of what any covenant or easement document might technically allow. If the HOA needed access to someone's land for legitimate community purposes, we'd negotiate an agreement in good faith, not force our way in and deal with the consequences later. I served as HOA president for 2 years, then passed the role to someone else, confident that we'd built systems that would prevent another Brenda Carmichael from abusing the position. I still attended meetings and stayed involved, but I was happy to step back from the leadership role. Looking back now, 3 years after that Tuesday morning when I first saw fresh dirt across my lawn, I'm struck by how one act of unauthorized trespass led to such a cascade of consequences. The drainage pipe in my yard was just a symptom of a deeper problem. Brenda Carmichael's belief that her position gave her the right to do whatever she wanted without accountability or oversight. That belief had infected every aspect of her leadership, from property rights to financial management. By refusing to accept the initial violation, I'd forced accountability on someone who'd never experienced it before. And that accountability had revealed 3 years of systematic fraud that had harmed dozens of families in our community. I don't regret any of it, the stress, the legal fights, the time and energy spent pursuing justice. Because the alternative would have been to let corruption and abuse continue unchecked. And that's not the kind of community I wanted to live in. My backyard is beautiful now, green and level, with mature landscaping and a drainage system that actually works. But more important than the aesthetic improvements is what that backyard represents. Proof that individuals can stand up to institutional power, that accountability matters, and that sometimes doing the right thing requires fighting battles you never expected to face. Pete and I were sitting on my back deck on a Saturday afternoon in late May, 3 years almost to the day after the drainage pipe first appeared, when he raised his beer in a toast to Connor Hayes, the man who took down a corrupt HOA and lived to tell the tale. I clinked my beer against his, to proper drainage and holding people accountable. We laughed, and I looked out at my yard, whole and healthy and properly drained. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought over things as simple as a buried pipe, because those battles reveal the character of the people and institutions we trust with power over our lives. The drainage pipe that the HOA buried through my yard without permission had done more than redirect water. It had redirected the entire trajectory of our community, exposing corruption, forcing accountability, and ultimately creating a stronger, more transparent neighborhood association. And every time it rained, I watched the water drain away properly, flowing through that correctly installed pipe to the street system where it belonged, and I smiled knowing that sometimes even the worst violations can lead to the best outcomes if you're willing to stand up and fight for what's right. The sun was setting over Meadowbrook Heights, casting long shadows across lawns that were green and healthy, maintained by an HOA that now operated with transparency and accountability. Children played in yards that belonged to families who could trust their community leadership. And I sat on my deck, at peace with the knowledge that when someone had tried to run roughshod over my property rights, I'd fought back and won not just for myself, but for everyone who called this place home. That unauthorized drainage pipe had been the worst thing that ever happened to our neighborhood.